All right. Welcome, everybody, to Curiosity Corner Live. We have lots of people. Anthony's here, Isaac is here, Katarina is here, Alyssa is here, Mom Engineering the Future is here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And every day at 10:30, we're going to bring you live science content like this every weekday at 10:30. We're moving away from weekends. Not to say that we'll never post on weekends, but weekends will be much rarer. It'll mostly just be live at 10:30. But every day at 10:30, make sure you come back. We're going to have so much fun. Today is all about dimension. So I'm Andy. Bow ties are cool. And I'm going to talk to you about dimension. So when I say dimension, everything in the world has certain ways that we can measure it. We can measure how tall it is, we can measure how long it is, we can measure how wide it is, length, width, and height. So for instance, something like a cube, that is very easy to measure. Length, width, and height. This is width. So there you go. So length, width, height. Everything has length, width, and height. Even strange shaped objects have length, width, and height. The width is probably an inch, length maybe 2-3 inches, and then the height looks like it's 3 or 4 inches. Dimension is the directions you can go in space, the ways that you can measure distances in space. And we live in a 3-dimensional universe. Everything has length, width, and height, and you can go up, you can go to the side, you can go back and forth. Those are the 3 dimensions that we can work with. But where do those 3 dimensions come from, and how can you sort of build them and understand the mathematics behind it? Well, I have a visual aid here other than my little ponycorn there. I have a website called Tinkercad. So I will share my full screen here. And this website, it's a free online website. And it shows you a 3D workspace. So here's the 3D workspace. And you can use different shapes to come on. Okay, never mind. You can use different shapes. There we go. You can bring in different shapes. That is colossal, gigantic cube. You can bring in different shapes, he says, for the 5 millionth time, and adjust their dimensions. You can change them, change their shapes, however you see fit. Does paper have width? We will get to that. We will definitely get to that. So this little box is 3-dimensional. It has length, width, and height. And the program is telling me that it's 20 millimeters wide, 20 millimeters long, and then it's 9 millimeters tall. So that thing is 3-dimensional. I have something else here that has 0 dimensions. There it is. It was invisible because it has 0 dimensions. It's a single point, just a single dot. And if I change one of these numbers, length, width, height, I can bring it into the first dimension. So I'm going to change that length to 20, and there we go. Now we have a line, and that line only has length. It doesn't have any other dimension at all. Only length. So that length is 20 millimeters. So that's the first dimension, length, just a line. And then the second dimension, width, we change that to 20. Boom, now we have a square. Squares and other two-dimensional shapes, like, say, a circle only has, a circle, there we go. That circle only has length and width. It's round, it's a different shape, but if we measured everything on there, we would only get length and width. So those are the first two dimensions. And then there's the third dimension. So we bring this two-dimensional world into a third dimension there. And then we can change the height. Boom. And now this box is three-dimensional. So you take a point, you stretch it into a line, that gives you the first dimension, and you stretch that line into a square, that's the second dimension, you stretch that square into a cube. What kind of careers would use Tinkercad? Well, Tinkercad is a easy-to-use computer-aided design software, and there's lots of different kinds of that software out there. Engineers use CAD software to design parts for machines, and there's also medical, so a prosthetist, for instance, someone who makes prosthetics for people who lost a limb or a finger or something like that, then they could use CAD software to design something for someone who needed an artificial limb. And people in the medical field, not only in prosthetics, but if someone needed to design, say, an artificial heart, they would use CAD software to do that as well. Tinkercad is not that advanced. It won't no one is going to be designing a usable mechanical heart in Tinkercad, but Tinkercad can be used for 3D printing. So you can design something in 3D printing and send it to a 3D printer. And Tinkercad has a lot of different possibilities. So the question that was posed by Anthony earlier was, does paper have width? Since paper is in three-dimensional world, it does have width. So it's really easy to measure this piece of paper, the length and height, if I hold it like this. So the length is 11 inches, and then the height would be 8.5. But that thickness, that width, is really, really thin. It's probably something like 1/10 of a millimeter, but it's still there because this thing is in a three-dimensional world. If we brought this into a two-dimensional world, then it wouldn't have width. It would just have length and height. Those names, length, width, and height, that's just what we call the different dimensions. I'm calling the first dimension length, the second dimension width, and the third dimension height. But sometimes people call it length, height, and depth. So it depends on the way that you're looking at it. It always depends on perspective. So you start with a line, you stretch that into a square or something like that, and then you stretch that into a cube. But what if you could stretch that cube even further? So that is where this comes in. So I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to show you something that thing right there looks very weird. But this shape is called a hypercube, and this is a 4-dimensional object. So if we lived in a world that didn't have just 3, but 4 dimensions, this might be what something like that would look like. But the problem is we live in a 3-dimensional world. So this is what a 4-dimensional object that is rotating might look like in a 3-dimensional world. It looks like it's 2 cubes stuck together, and they're stretching and turning inside out, but then it turns into a normal cube. It's behaving in a very strange way. It's moving in a dimension that we have no understanding of. So if this kind of thing came into the 3rd dimension, it would look like a cube, but then it would start behaving in a weird way. So that's something wild to think about. It's just the same idea with if you took a 3-dimensional object like a cube and brought it into a 2-dimensional world, it would look like a 2-dimensional object, but it would be 3-dimensional. It would just be moving along that 3rd dimension. Does a pencil mark have width? Yes. So I have a marker. It's about the same. So if I drew a line on this piece of paper here, so I drew a line on that piece of paper, that line, we can say it's 1-dimensional because it's a line drawn on a 2-dimensional thing. But since it's in a 3-dimensional world, the paper has width, and the line, we could measure the length and the thickness, but there is also a 3rd dimension to it. If we went way, way down on like a very tiny level, a while ago I mentioned nanotechnology. It wouldn't quite be nano, it might be micro, which is a little above nano. But the way that pencils and markers work is they take a little bit of that ink or a little bit of the pencil lead, and they put a tiny bit of it, a tiny layer of it on top of the piece of paper, and some of it gets into the grains of the piece of paper. So we could measure the thickness of the paper, and if we measured it right where that line is, it would be incredibly tiny, but it would be slightly thicker right there, by probably a few molecules width. It would be thin, but it still has that thickness. So even a pencil mark, because it's in a 3-dimensional world, is still 3-dimensional. It still has length, width, and height. Everything in the universe is 3-dimensional because we live in a 3-dimensional world. There's some things that look 2-dimensional, but they're not really. Even shadows are actually 3-dimensional, because a shadow is when you're blocking the light. We see when it gets projected onto the ground and it looks flat. But if we had a way to see all the air and how the light is hitting all the air, we would see that the shadow is being blocked by a bunch of different little things in the air, and we would see that the shadow is 3-dimensional. So now that I have gone through all the dimensions, and I've sufficiently blown your mind with that thing, the hypercube, that brings me to my challenge. So we have a few different challenges that you can try out today. One is you can try out Tinkercad, see what you can design, and share those kinds of designs on social media with our hashtag StayCuriousCLE. Tinkercad does require a free account. So you'll need to get your parents' permission to set that up. You can try out Tinkercad, see what you can design with it. What's cool with Tinkercad is that you can design something and then you can save it as a three-dimensional object, or you can save it as a two-dimensional object. So it will take it and sort of flatten it, and you can see it if it was a 3D object taken into a second two-dimensional world. So that's one possibility. Something else that you can try out is to explore the world around you and think about things and what they might look like in different universes. So if there was a two-dimensional world, think about what something would look like in that world. Or you can measure the dimensions of those objects around you. And with that, I will thank you very much for joining me on today's episode of Curiosity Corner Live. Don't forget, we have awesome videos just like this one every day at 10:30. So make sure you come back tomorrow. I will be back again, and I'll be talking about oxidation. So we'll be doing a bit of a chemistry show tomorrow. So thanks for joining me. My name's Andy. Bow ties are cool, and stay curious.